The whole premise of Invincible is that the Viltrumites are unbeatable. That's what the show wants you to believe, and for most of the story, the evidence supports it. They survived a civil war that cut their own population in half and came out stronger. They have been conquering planets for thousands of years and have never lost one they decided to take. It seems like the only thing that has ever reliably stopped a Viltrumite is another Viltrumite, but that's not actually true. And the people who know that that's just a myth nearly wiped the Empire off the map. Today we are going through every confirmed Viltrumite weakness, and by the time this list is done, the Viltrumites look a lot less like gods and a lot more like us. This is the one the show has already started pulling on, and most people do not fully understand why it works the way it does. Viltrumites can fly. That's not a mystery. But the mechanism behind their flight is, unlike most flying characters in fiction who just have vague energy or muscle-based lift, Viltrumites fly through a complex biological balancing system located in their inner ears. The inner ear is responsible for their equilibrium, their spatial orientation, and their ability to move through 3 dimensions at speeds that would completely disorient any other biological system. It's a specialized piece of anatomy that has been refined over thousands of years of evolution to make them the most precise flyers in the known universe. The trade-off is that those ears are also extremely sensitive. The same biological precision that lets a Viltrumite navigate at hypersonic speeds makes them vulnerable to specific frequencies. When a sound hits that frequency range, it doesn't just hurt, it attacks the entire system, balance collapses, spatial orientation breaks down. A Viltrumite who can fly at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour suddenly can't tell which way is up. The show introduced this in Season 2 when a creature in Atlantis let out a shriek at a frequency that visibly incapacitated Mark mid-fight. The comics established the inner ear weakness through different means, but the show is using that moment to establish the same thing. The people watching now know the weakness exists, but many of their enemies have yet to figure it out. That gap is deliberate. In the comics, Cecil figured this out and built it into Mark's earpiece, giving the G-Die a kill switch they could activate remotely. And Robot took it further by designing his anti-Viltrumite drones to exploit the same principle. The drones were engineered to produce the specific frequency necessary on impact, meaning every time a Viltrumite hit one of them, the fight got harder. The more they attacked, the more the system worked against them. Robot built a weapon that used Viltrumite aggression as its power source. The implications of this weakness extend well beyond a single fight. Think about what that means. Any sufficiently advanced civilization with good acoustic engineering could theoretically develop anti-Viltrumite technology. Every time a Viltrumite chooses to fly, they are putting their most critical vulnerability into active use. The very thing that makes them terrifying in space combat is also their most accessible pressure point. Viltrumites are invulnerable to almost everything the universe can throw at them. Extreme cold, vacuum, radiation, nuclear detonations, none of it leaves lasting damage. Their healing factor processes the injury and closes it before the fight is over. The one thing their healing abilities cannot handle is stellar heat, the actual plasma of a star. This comes down to Viltrumite biology. 2. Their skin regenerates so quickly that most attacks are sealed before they can penetrate. The density they have built up over thousands of years of evolution means standard physical trauma never gets deep enough to do lasting harm. But stellar plasma operates at temperatures so extreme that it overwhelms the regeneration rate entirely. The healing factor cannot close the wound faster than the heat is opening it. At those temperatures, Viltrumite invulnerability doesn't disappear, it just gets outpaced. In the comics, Mark uses this deliberately in his final confrontation with Thrag. He drags their fight all the way into the sun, knowing that the environment will cost both of them, but knowing that the cost is different for each of them. The environment strips both of them down equally, but by the time they get there, the accumulated damage of the fight has already been building on Thrag for days. Prolonged solar exposure combined with everything that came before, it's what finally ends him. Even Thrag cannot survive indefinite stellar exposure when he is already fighting on empty. The fight that ends the most terrifying being in the Invincible universe happens because Mark found the one arena where Thrag's advantage is narrow. And when you understand that, you realize this was never just a brawl. That's not luck, that's research, preparation, and the specific kind of desperation that comes from knowing you have to win a fight you were not supposed to be able to win. For the show, this matters enormously going forward. The sun is right there. It has always been right there. Every fight that takes place in space is a fight that happens within reach of the one environment where Viltrumite invulnerability can actually be eroded. The Coalition just needed someone willing to drag the fight there. This is the one that nearly ended the Viltrumite race entirely. Not a weapon, not a warrior. A pathogen. The Scourge virus was created by Thetis, a Viltrumite who turned against his own kind, and founded the Coalition of Planets specifically to stop them. He synthesized the virus from his own blood, engineering it to target the specific genetic code that makes Viltrumites what they are. The same DNA that gives them their strength became the delivery mechanism for their near extinction. When the Scourge hit Viltrum, it moved through the population at a speed the Empire wasn't ready for. They could not quarantine it, they could not fight it physically, there was nothing to punch. The virus simply did what viruses do and moved through every Viltrumite body on the planet. In less than a year, nearly the entire Viltrumite race was dead. A species that had been conquering galaxies for thousands of years got cut down to fewer than 50 pure-blooded survivors by something they couldn't even see. The survivors faced something worse than death in some ways. The virus didn't leave them unaffected. Even the Viltrumites who fought off the infection found their strength and invulnerability massively diminished in the aftermath. Any injury sustained during that window of weakness could become permanent damage. Wounds that would have sealed under normal circumstances left lasting marks because the healing factor was compromised. The reason this matters beyond just the history is the second strain. Thetis developed an improved version of the Scourge that was designed to bypass the immunity the survivors had built up. A virus engineered to kill beings who had already survived its first iteration. Mark gets infected by this version in the comics, and the effects are significant. He weakens considerably, his durability drops, he gets sick in a way that Viltrumite physiology is not supposed to allow. He never fully loses his powers, but he is operating at a fraction of his normal capacity, which in a war is almost as dangerous as losing them entirely. Mark eventually fights off the infection, something attributed to his hybrid genetics. His human DNA appears to give his system a different pathway to fight the virus that pure-blood Viltrumites do not have. But the second strain also comes with a terrifying complication. An improved version was developed with the potential to kill human beings as well, not just Viltrumites. The weapon created to end the Empire could become a threat to the very species it was built to protect. The Scourge is the most dangerous item in this universe because it doesn't care about power levels, it doesn't matter how strong you are, it doesn't matter how fast you can fly. The virus targets your genetics, not your strength, and there is no amount of physical strength that can stop it. There is also something worth saying about what the Scourge virus represents for the Empire's psychology. The Viltrumites built their entire civilization on the premise that strength is the only thing that matters. Weakness gets eliminated, the strong survive. And then a virus specifically engineered to target their unique genetic code reduced the most powerful species in the galaxy to fewer than 50 survivors in under a year. The Empire that purged its own weak to build an unbeatable warrior race nearly went extinct to something that a warrior's strength was completely irrelevant against. The survivors could not tell anyone. Admitting the Scourge happened means admitting the Empire is not what it presents itself to be. Admitting that there are fewer than 50 of them means admitting the invasion of Earth is not a conquest operation anymore. It's a breeding program. The Empire is not conquering Earth because it wants Earth. It's going to Earth because human DNA is genetically compatible with Viltrumite DNA, and they desperately need to replenish their numbers before the species disappears entirely. The most feared conquerors in the galaxy are running a survival operation and calling it expansion. The Scourge was created in a lab. The Klaxus plant was just growing somewhere in the universe, minding its own business, and the Viltrumites were terrified of it anyway. The Klaxus is an alien plant that that produces a poison capable of stripping a Viltrumite of their powers entirely. Not reducing them, not weakening them gradually. The full suite. Strength, durability, healing factor, all of it gone. A Viltrumite exposed to Klax's poison becomes, for all practical purposes, a regular human being. A standard weapon that would bounce off their skin on a normal day can now kill them. This is significant enough that the Viltrumites went out of their way to suppress it. They seeded the planet where Klaxus grows with Sinlac beetles, a species that eats the plant faster than it can grow back. The Empire's solution to a plant they could not beat in a fight was to introduce a pest that would starve it out of existence. That level of institutional effort to deal with a plant tells you everything about how seriously they take it. The Coalition got hold of Klax's extracts thanks to Omni-Man, who included information about it in the hidden weaknesses encoded in his sci-fi novels. Alan the alien and Nolan tracked down these weaknesses together during their mission for Thetis, and the Klaxus information is part of what they bring back. The Empire went to great lengths to keep this quiet, and those lengths failed. And here is what makes this genuinely wild. The Klaxus is not a weapon you have to build. It grows. With minimal resources and the right conditions, it spreads. The only thing keeping it from being a widespread counter to Viltrumite power is the beetles, and the beetles can be removed. The Coalition had in their hands the potential to grow a weapon that the most powerful beings in the galaxy had no physical defense against. There are things in this universe that the Viltrumites are afraid of, not cautious about, actually afraid of. The Ragnar are one of them. The Ragnar are a savage alien species with one overwhelming characteristic. They eat everything. Not selectively, everything in their path gets consumed. They do not think in terms of threat assessment or tactical retreat. They do not recognize that something is too powerful to attack. They just attack, and their claws and fangs can tear through Viltrumite skin. That last detail is the important one. Viltrumite invulnerability is not invulnerability to everything. It's invulnerable to most things. The Ragnar are specifically built in a way that bypasses it. Their physical composition means they can open wounds in a Viltrumite that the healing factor then has to close, which in a prolonged fight means the Ragnar are constantly doing damage that the Viltrumite is constantly having to repair. That's not a fight where Viltrumite durability counts for much. The Ragnar are one of the few creatures in the known universe capable of seriously injuring a Viltrumite. Even Thrag, the most powerful Viltrumite alive, treats encounters with them as genuinely dangerous rather than routine. He kills them eventually, but not without cost. The Empire's internal policy is to avoid Ragnar in combat entirely where possible rather than absorb the casualties, and when the most powerful being in the galaxy is cautious about something, that caution is worth paying attention to. Nolan documented the Ragnar in his hidden books, which is how Alan and the Coalition eventually found them and brought them into the Viltrumite war effort. The Ragnar were fitted with mind-controlled devices to direct their attacks because without direction, they would consume everything, including the Coalition forces. That detail matters. A weapon so dangerous that it cannot be aimed without technological intervention. You do not get to use the Ragnar casually. You deploy them and then get out of the way, and we think this is one of the most revealing things in the entire series about how the Empire actually functions. A species that teaches its children that strength is everything, that weakness cannot be allowed to exist, maintains a standing policy of running from a beast it cannot beat. That contradiction lives inside the Imperial ideology and never gets resolved. Most weapons in this universe bounce off Viltrumite skin. Space Racer's gun doesn't. The specifics of what his weapon actually is remain somewhat deliberately vague in both the comics and the show. What is established is the operational fact. The blast from Space Racer's gun is powerful enough to punch through Viltrumite flesh before their healing factor can respond. It's not that the gun has some magical anti-Viltrumite property, it's just that powerful, more powerful than anything else in the known universe, like it fires and things die. The gun also punches through anything else, buildings, ships. In the Viltrumite War arc, Space Racer uses it to help crack open the core of the planet Viltrum itself, working with Mark and Nolan to destabilize and ultimately destroy the Viltrumite homeworld. A weapon that can open up a planet from the inside is not something you put a ceiling on. Omni-Man understood exactly how dangerous this was. When he encountered Space Racer, he didn't try to fight him. He buried him on an asteroid and left him to die slowly from starvation. Except Viltrumites and Space Racer cannot die of starvation or suffocation, so that plan also failed. The point is that Nolan's response to Space Racer was not combat. It was containment. A being who fights planets for breakfast decided the correct response to Space Racer was to put him somewhere he could not use the gun. Space Racer eventually gets found by the Coalition, dug out of his asteroid, pointed at the Empire, and the results speak for themselves. The gun that Omni-Man spent decades trying to keep out of the fight becomes one of the decisive instruments of the Viltrumite War, and once you understand what that means, the whole power scaling conversation in this show changes. There exists at least one weapon in the universe that can end them cleanly and quickly. And that knowledge changes the psychological landscape of every conflict involving Viltrumites. They are not fighting under the assumption that nothing can kill them. They are fighting knowing that somewhere out there, something can. The show has been setting Space Racer up carefully through the references Nolan leaves behind. The books he asks Mark to read contain his location. The gun is not lost. It's not broken. It's sitting on an asteroid waiting for the moment the Coalition is ready to use it. Season 4 is the season that moment arrives. And when it does, every Viltrumite who believed the fight was unwinnable is going to have to reconsider that belief in real time. There is also something almost poetic about the gun's role in the Viltrumite War arc. The Empire spent centuries building a reputation for invulnerability. The reputation itself was a weapon. Planets surrendered without fighting because the Viltrumites seemed unstoppable. Space Racer's gun doesn't just kill individual Viltrumites, it breaks the myth. Once you have seen the gun work, you know the invulnerability is not absolute, and that knowledge spreads. That's what Omni-Man was really trying to contain when he buried Space Racer on an asteroid. Not just the weapon. The idea that the weapon represented the outside of a Viltrumite is extremely hard to damage. The inside is a different story. Viltrumite durability is concentrated on their exterior, the skin, the bone density, the healing factor that closes surface wounds almost as fast as they open, but internal damage presents a different challenge for the healing factor. When damage bypasses the exterior and detonates or operates inside the body, the healing factor has to work from the inside out rather than sealing a surface wound. That's a harder problem, and it takes longer. What Robot demonstrated this when he killed an alternate universe Invincible in the comics by getting a bomb down his throat and detonating it internally, not a scratch on the outside. Dead from the inside. The principle is not that Viltrumites are fragile internally, they are not. It's that internal explosions are significantly harder for the healing factor to counter than surface damage. This shows up in combat application more broadly. Characters who manage to get their hands or weapons inside a Viltrumite's body cavity do damage that their healing factor has to work considerably harder to address. Alan, the alien, in the Viltrumite War, shoves his arm through a Viltrumite's stomach with his fist coming out the other side. That's not just a show of strength, that's exploitation of the fact that internal damage to a Viltrumite doesn't get processed the same way surface damage does. The practical lesson here for anyone fighting a Viltrumite is that the approach matters as much as the power. Hitting the outside of a Viltrumite at near Viltrumite strength levels does manageable damage. Getting something inside that exterior is a different calculation entirely. This one doesn't show up in any official weakness list. It doesn't get an entry in the Invincible handbook. It never gets weaponized in a traditional sense. But across the full run of the comics, it's the weakness that does more damage to the Viltrumite Empire than almost anything else. The Empire runs on ideology, strength is everything. Weakness cannot be allowed to survive. Emotional attachment is not a Viltrumite concept in any healthy sense. From birth, Viltrumites are conditioned to see love and empathy as contaminants, things that soften the edge that keeps the species dominant. It's not accidental conditioning, it's the deliberate architecture of a society that needs its members to be willing to kill without hesitation and conquer without grief. And here is what the Empire never saw coming. Nolan spent decades on Earth. Long enough to fall in love with Debbie, long enough to raise Mark, long enough for the conditioning to crack under the weight of actual human connection. When the moment came for him to kill Mark and complete his mission, he could not do it. The Empire's most trusted agent in the most important infiltration operation in their history failed because he loved his son. And then in the aftermath of the Viltrumite War, when the surviving Viltrumites came to Earth as part of the breeding arrangement with humanity, the same thing happened at scale. They stayed. They formed connections, they had children with human partners, and watched those children grow up with human values. The Empire sent warriors to use a planet and got back something it could not use for conquest anymore. The Viltrumite conditioning is strong. Thousands of years of ideological pressure do not evaporate overnight, but it's not permanent. It was never designed to hold against centuries of genuine human contact, because the designers never imagined a scenario where their warriors would have centuries of genuine human contact. They sent soldiers. The soldiers became something else. Nolan himself acknowledges this at the end of the comics. His heart, he says, is too damaged to let his body fully heal from his final injuries. Not physically too damaged, emotionally, the love he developed for his family became the thing his Viltrumite physiology could not close around. The weakness that the Empire never listed in any handbook was the one that ultimately defined the arc of the entire series. What makes this so significant from a narrative standpoint is that it was not avoidable. The Empire's strategy required long-term infiltration. Long-term infiltration required Viltrumites to live among the species they were eventually going to help conquer, and living among a species, really living among them, rather than just occupying their space, eventually does something to anyone with the capacity for feeling, even a Viltrumite. The ideology that says emotions are weakness was built for a civilization of conquerors who never stayed anywhere long enough to care about it. The moment the strategy changed and required sustained contact with other species, the conditioning that held that ideology in place was on borrowed time. Thrag understood this at some level. It's why he tries to control the breeding arrangement so tightly, not just to replenish numbers, to prevent exactly the kind of cross-species attachment that turned Nolan into someone who chose his half-human son over the Empire he had served for centuries. The Empire's greatest threat to its own existence was not the Coalition, was not the Scourge, was not Space Racer's gun. It was what happened when its own soldiers started caring about something other than conquest. This one is less dramatic than a virus or a plant, but it matters for how the power scaling in this show actually works. Viltrumites are not born at full power, they grow into it. The process is slow by human standards, but it maps onto their lifespan in a way that makes sense. A Viltrumite who has been alive for 1,000 years is not the same threat as one who has been alive for 20. Mark, at the start of the show, is a teenager with Viltrumite biology, but not Viltrumite experience. And Anissa beating him half to death in Season 2 makes complete sense when you understand this. The gap between a young Viltrumite and an older one is not just about strength. It's about everything you pick up from centuries of actual fighting, reading opponents, taking hits without panicking, moving efficiently. Mark doesn't have any of that yet. He has the biology, but not the experience. Conquest has been doing this for thousands of years. That's the difference. What this means practically is that early in the series, Mark can be hurt by things that would not register against an experienced Viltrumite. He can be outmaneuvered, he can be outpaced in specific exchanges. The Viltrumite invulnerability is real, but it scales with age, and the age gap between Mark and every other Viltrumite he faces for most of the show is measured in centuries, and the show is already showing this progression in a way that rewards people people who are paying attention. Mark in Season 3 fights differently from Mark in Season 1, not just stronger, smarter in the way someone gets smart from getting hurt enough times. He has started internalizing lessons from every beating. That's Viltrumite development in action, slow at first, then compounding. This also means that as the show continues, Mark becomes progressively harder to stop through natural development alone. Every fight he survives, every injury he heals from, every enemy he beats on the way to the next one is adding to that experience base. And if you have been paying attention to how differently he fights now compared to Season 1, you already know what we are talking about. The ceiling on what Mark can eventually become is genuinely unknown, and that's by design. Kirkman built a character whose full potential the story has not yet had to confront. The version of Mark Grayson that exists by Season 4 is not the same fighter who got destroyed by Angstrom Levy or even his own father. He is growing into the full expression of what his biology can actually do, and while that growth has a ceiling the show has yet to name, there are still some areas of weakness that Mark and every other Viltrumite has to contend with. If this kind of breakdown is your thing, subscribe. We do this every week,